I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to episode 52 of Chasing Ghosts in Irregular Warfare podcast. The title of this podcast will be CG Excursion, Churchill, Imperial, Bombast, and the Death of the West. Now, I have some housekeeping to take care of before we get into this. By the way, the reason I'm doing this podcast is because I happen to be a big fan of Daryl Cooper and the Martyr Made podcast. And I would say that between CJ Kilmer at the Dangerous History podcast and Daryl Cooper at the Martyr Made podcast, these would probably be patient zero for the reason why I started my podcast in the first place. And they are the folks that I technically and historically try to emulate as a very second-rate student to match what I consider the brilliance of what they bring to the table when it comes to revisiting history in a much more rational and much less statist lens in the way it's viewed. Like I said, a little bit of housekeeping. I would love for you guys to visit the blog at the Libertarian Institute. I will put the address in the show notes 3, 4, 5 days a week, depending on how busy I am that week. I take on various aspects of the U.S. and Western defense modalities and weapon systems, exquisite platforms, that kind of thing. And I think for the most part, I have to take a chainsaw to them because they're so poorly conceived, they're so poorly employed, and we have so many chaos avalanches in the West when it comes to feeding these exquisite platforms, including my increasingly urgent call to arms to stop building aircraft carriers. For instance, the era of manned tanks is over. If we had sober, reflective, and historically read policymakers, defense intellectuals, and such in the U.S. and the West, I would think a lot of all this would come to a screeching halt because I think, for the most part, some commission needs to be established by whatever administration gets into power in January of next year to put a full stop to everything going on in the U.S. and Western militaries. Everybody take a knee, drink water, and reassess what the revolutionary elements are of the changes and the way mankind conducts warfare in the 21st century, because it simply isn't being done. So like I said, I will put that blog address in the show notes. I would urge all of my listeners, if you get a chance and to spread the word, to take a look at that, where I am the Smedley D. Butler Fellow for Military Affairs at the Libertarian Institute. What have I been reading lately? Well, I read a lot, as everybody knows. When I hear Daryl Cooper talking about how many books he reads, I think, man, I'd love to give him a run for his money, but I think he has more time on his hands than I do. I'm reading a former colleague and fellow serving officer in the 101st Airborne Division, and also when I was overseas in Afghanistan, Lieutenant General Dan Bolger, one of my favorite officers of all time in the U.S. military contemporaneously, who I first encountered him when he wrote this great war novel in the 1990s, I think it was, called Feast of Bones, about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. And as a writer, he's incredibly talented. Well, he wrote a book called Why We Lost. And the great thing about this is not only is he a great prose writer, not only is he a compelling narrative historian, but he doesn't start talking about why we lost Afghanistan and Iraq in October of 2001 when boots on the ground arrived in northern Afghanistan and then 2 years later, unfortunately, into Iraq. He takes us back forensically and he examines the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and all the historical, territorial, and cultural preambles to what brought us to that place in the first place. and this place of infamous disaster, stalemate, and defeat of the U.S. forces once again. And I'm always emphasizing that the U.S. hasn't won a conflict since 1945, and that track record remains so. So I urge all of you, if you get a chance, Why We Lost, Dan Bolger, I'll put that in the show notes. I'm also seeing, as most of you know, I have a bone in my teeth when it comes to aircraft carriers. I served in the U.S. Navy as an enlisted guy. I later on got my commission in the Army to avoid sea duty. And I thought, well, I won't get deployed. Well, they deployed the stuff out of me as a result of that. But nonetheless, I have this almost collegial and familial relationship to the U.S. Navy. It's a service that I was proud to serve in, as I was in the Army. There are things that both services have done that are ignominious and things that I would not be proud of, but nonetheless, I think that's the way it is with all of our career paths and vocations. But nonetheless, I've had a bone in my teeth about aircraft carriers, and I write about that in that blog extensively. I've done dispatches on this podcast. I've done a podcast on that very thing. I would urge my listeners to listen to it if you get the opportunity. I'll make sure that I put that in the show notes. Also, it seems, and of course, this is the thing where, we're a Toyota family. So if I get another Toyota, I look around, oh man, lots of people are driving those, only because we're noticing it as a result. Maybe that's the case for me, but I do think there is momentum gathering across the defense intelligentsia in the West in which some people are scratching their heads and actually saying, well, what is the concept of operations and concept of employment for aircraft carriers in the 21st century when, in the end, especially against near-peer and peer competitors like the Chinese, the Russians, and the Indians are on the horizon, Brazilians and such, these are missile sponges. As I've said before, this is going to be a war of the leakers, which means that you may have the most robust and impressive IAMD, your integrated air and missile defense system, whether it is seaborne, airborne, or landborne, but something's going to get through inevitably in salvo competition, and in this case, we're talking about 5,000 sailors and the associated sailors that are in the armada that is forming a ring of protection around said aircraft carrier. And I want to remind you again, and I want to bang the drum, when it comes to reduced carrier air wings, when it comes to establishing the combat air patrols and the barrier combat air patrols, which is simply the external perimeter, the combat air patrol, the CAP, that has to go over this carrier and its armada to protect it from incoming missiles or aircraft, you are lucky to have a strike package in 12 hours of more than 10 aircraft. Most likely less than 10 aircraft. And if you are engaging the Chinese in the Pacific, in which, unlike the Atlantic, the American Navy is not the sovereign there, but then again, we look at the Red Sea and we figure that, well, the American Navy isn't the sovereign there either, are they? So I see the momentum gathering as far as calling the ball and saying, stop building aircraft carriers, which speaks to the broader question that I brought up time and time again. Stop building exquisite platforms when salvo competition allows you to use much cheaper munitions or singular munition to take out very expensive platforms. Like, if I recall, 20 of the 31 M1 Abrams that were sent to the Ukrainians are now scrap metal. I'm not proud of this forecast. You know I don't like the word prediction. But I did make a forecast where I said that once they go there, they will become scrap within 72 hours of crossing any line that goes into the eastern third of the Ukraine. I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so. So if you wish to get in touch with me, you can email me directly at cgpodcast at pm.me. That is cgpodcast at pm.me. I would urge all of you, if you get the chance, I say this hat in hand, leave reviews on the podcast vendor of this podcast as you wish. And then also reach out to friends, family, neighbors, colleagues who may be interested in this sort of arcane and esoteric topic that we tackle here at Chasing Ghosts, and let them know that there's some interesting stuff going on here. I would call your attention to episode 4, where I talk about the impossibility of successful Western counterinsurgency and make the case for that, and episode 37, starting my Storming America series, where I talk about the upscaled upsize forecast I have of the October 7th, 2023 invasion of Israel by Gazan irregular forces and how that can be replicated tomorrow morning here in the United States. That is something in which I think it's a matter of when, not if. I don't wish it, and I want to be wrong. So, onward and upward, episode 52, CG Excursion, which means that it's sort of out at bailiwick of irregular warfare, but nonetheless, I think it tangentially touches it as it does with all conflict and warfare. The title of this is Churchill, Imperial, Bombast, and the Death of the West. And the reason that I'm recording this today is because about a week ago, and this podcast will probably be uploaded, making that a fortnight instead of a week ago, Tucker Carlson, one of my favorite interviewers on the X, interviewed Daryl Cooper of Martyrmade, which is a podcast that I urge everybody who listens to me to seek out. Even if you do it at the expense of listening to me, you will be richer for it. Now, you may not agree with everything that he has to say, but I would hope that you don't agree with everything I have to say. That way that we can have a much more interesting, convivial, and scintillating conversation about things, because if we agreed on everything, how interesting would that be? As a matter of fact, why listen in the first place? What I love about Daryl Cooper is he's an amateur historian, so he isn't tainted, touched, or, in my mind, compromised by being a member of the professoriate, having a PhD in history, or, worse yet, being a member of that horrific Marxian government supremacist sewage outlet called the American Historical Association, which I think is just, it has done such a horrific disservice to history. And yes, they are the same ones who look at military history and think themselves much too sophisticated or even morally superior to doing such a thing, which is one reason why you see military history at maybe half a dozen colleges in the United States and the West, I suppose. I do wish that it were an interest and an avocation and a profession that got more attention, got more dollars, and in the end, gave us more military historians. But you'll find that most of the best military historians, in my mind, over the last 200 years, haven't necessarily come out of the official credentialed university pipeline. And in my mind, for the most part, there's going to be exceptions and outliers to this, tend to be better historians. So someone would ask me, but when it comes to history, what does that mean? I mean, I was going to get an MA in history, and I did not. I got an MA in something else. And I started 2 semesters at Ole Miss, where I was teaching at the time as a PMS. And what I discovered was what makes a good historian doesn't necessarily need me to go through the pipeline of accreditation and credentialing to have a history PhD. If I can read, if I practice syntopical reading, which is reading many books on the same subject, and you will find that Daryl Cooper does just that thing. If you read primary and secondary source documentation. A friend of mine, Steve Wiper, who I knew in Arizona, we correspond on occasion. He is the head of Classic Warships Publishing. I'd say he has well over 100 books. I know I have well over 100 of his. What he does is they're about 60, 72, 80 pages, much like Osprey. Not only is he a historical expert who has a very impressive collection at his house of both primary and secondary source documentation of naval warfare in his office behind his house, but he also happens to be a documentarian and an imagery specialist, and he knows imagery inside and out. These are pictorial books, but he annotates them with very great narratives that speak to those, and he's got an expertise in this. As a matter of fact, I think he's been retained on a few documentaries, things like this. He has experience actually going to shipwrecks and such. He doesn't have a formal PhD. He doesn't have any of that, and he's probably one of the most capable naval historians that I'm aware of. I think for the most part, and I think most of my listeners, if you've been hearing me for a while, know the disdain which I hold the Western university system in the last 100 years, and I think it doesn't produce many people who are capable of a dispassionate history, especially when it comes to military history, that is going to speak to facts, conjecture, counterfactuals, things like that, but will probably tire out the readers or listeners with tired imposition of race, class, and gender and everything going back with one of the most egregious cases of presentism, which means that you take your contemporary moral and historical optics of what's going on now and you project backwards and you say, well, why aren't they thinking the way I do? It may make them think on their allegedly moral hobby horses that they're better than the rest of it, but it just makes for bad history. I got in a recent tussle on the X about Mary Beard, the Roman historian that the British Bolshevik Corporation in the UK holds in such high esteem, and they bring her on as a talking head. And I find her stuff plagued with presentism, plagued with being politically correct, and year by year she tries to take contemporary bugbears and inject them into history thousands of years in the past. And I think that if you take a look at Caesar's original commentaries, Tacitus's histories that were contemporary at the time, and you look at such worthies as Adrian Goldsworthy, Tom Holland, and others, there's just other folks out there who will impart a vision of Roman history that I think is much more consonant with reality than the moral hobby horsing of the likes of Miss Beard, who I just think is just not worth your time. Which brings us to our current topic of Winston Churchill. Now, he's a legendary figure, and he's a figure that's put up on a pedestal, and he's said to do so many masterful things. He's the savior of Western civilization. He's the man, the master and commander, who led the Allies in the West into victory in World War II to best the Axis powers and all of this. So, what do I think of Winston Churchill? It doesn't matter much what I think of him, even though I'm going to tell you what I think of him, because I want you all in the audience to come to your own conclusions. Not only have I been taken off the Christmas card list for the Aircraft Industrial Base Coalition, but I think the Churchill Society, neoconservatives, and neoliberals, and especially folks in the UK who comprise a Winston sycophancy complex that I can't get close to, are probably going to be miffed with me about what I say about Winston Churchill. They will be manning and woe-manning their feigning couches in droves, and I may even lose some listeners over this. So my apologies for any of you who choose to go away after this because of a gentlemanly disagreement, but there it is. The reason I do this podcast isn't to seek adulation and praise, but to plant the seeds in your heads of the questioning and interrogative frameworks of if received history is what it is or isn't. You decide. What I want to tell you as a preamble is this, is I do consider myself an amateur Churchill scholar. I've read books. That's what Darryl Cooper said, and he got lambasted because he reads books. I remember being on the X and some of the interlocutors were going, he reads books. That makes him an historian? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to be credentialed by the accredited university system and then get shipboard with Marxian Titanics like the American Historical Association and such so that I can be so freighted with contemporaneous presentism that I lose the bead and azimuth on how to tell good narrative history that makes sense with cause and effect? No, I refuse to do that. Now, I'd mentioned Syntopical. That speaks to Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. I urge all of you to do that. I know it sounds odd. Why would I ask you to read a book called How to Read a Book? It's because I want to make you more effective, not so much efficient, more effective at interrogating, questioning, and arriving at conclusions about the world that are much more reality-based than not. I've read all 3 volumes of Manchester's book. I've read John Charmley's book, Churchill's Grand Alliance. I've read Blood, Sweat, and Arrogance by Gordon Corrigan. I've read Churchill's Secret War by Madhusri Mukherjee. Oh man, I probably slaughtered that name. My apologies, madam. But nonetheless, it was about the Bengal famine in India during World War II and how Churchill was singularly responsible for that. And we'll go into that a little bit later. I have read John Charmley's book, Churchill, The End of Glory, a political biography. Andrew Roberts, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom, and a very interesting book, which I commend to all of you, which is called A Command of History by David Reynolds, which simply speaks to the creation, his 6-volume history of World War II. Now, here's what I'm going to give Churchill. A great writer, even though I think there was a lot of ghostwriting going on when it came to those 6 volumes. But he was a prolific author. And I mean, he gave L. Ron Hubbard a run for his money. This is a man who somehow published 43 books that filled 72 volumes. And throughout his life, and that doesn't include his articles, it doesn't include his speeches or anything like that. His first book was about the uprising in India, the story of the Malakand Field Force, which was published in 1898, at the tender age of 24. Now, Winston Churchill, of course, lived from 1874, dying at the age of 90 in 1965. Prolific author, prolific speechifier, prolific speech writer who put a lot of, I would say, blood, sweat, and tears into his speechifying. I am not going to take away from him being one of the most tremendous speechwriters and rhetoricians of the 20th century. Mind you, it could be the last few hundred years, if not centuries, if not millennia, of one of the finest speakers and communicators out there. Now, was everything he said accurate? Not necessarily. Were there bugbears and episodes of success? Of course there were. We're all human. He's human. Now, when Darryl Cooper did his interview with Jeffrey Tucker, I can't say that he was incorrect in what he says. Who am I to correct Darryl Cooper? I can say, though, and I think, did Darryl do this for hyperbole or Bombast himself to say that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II instead of a chief villain? He should have said a chief villain, because I do find Churchill to be a villain in World War II for a variety of reasons, and beforehand, that I will go over in some detail. I think that was a tactical error on his part. But then again, here we have a rather spontaneous interview where he's not reading notes. He's responding to questions from the estimable Tucker Carlson and saying, these things and making these conjectures. So who am I to hold that over his head? I think it was a tactically unsound thing to say. But then again, he's speaking extemporaneously. He doesn't have a parrot prompter in front of him, and he's speaking from all the stuff that he's read in this. By the way, in that interview, which, as I said, I will post in the show notes so that you can look at the primary source documentation, the interview itself, you will discover that what started all of this is that he's embarking on an episodic series on World War II. Keep in mind, I think he spent 26 to 31 hours talking about Jim Jones. And he details very interestingly in the Tucker Carlson interview why he simply didn't talk about Jim Jones, but used Jim Jones as a marker or a stand-in for the entire civil rights movement from the 40s through the Jonestown Massacre in 1978 in Guyana. And I think I love that kind of history. It really speaks to what Sebastian Junger did with The Perfect Storm in a number of his other books. John McPhee, I probably have an entire collection of his books. And then Mark Bowden, who wrote about WWII 1968 and Black Hawk Down. These are fellas who take these historical subjects and start to examine them by going back in history. Well, what's the cause and effect? How did that happen? Because history isn't simply about dates. History isn't about great men or great events or anything like that. History is about the cause and effect, the chaos avalanches, the complexification, the unintended consequences, the fog, the friction of what happened when rather, especially in military history, large, complex, adaptive systems, in this case, armies, in whatever numbers they may be, clashing with other armies, whatever numbers they may be, and what the outcomes are of that. So I've always thought history isn't dry at all if it's presented in the right fashion. And this isn't my first time talking about Churchill. If we go in the Wayback Machine, the hot tub time machine, and we go all the way back to episode 3, Michael Collins' The Empire Blinks, I talk about what was, for the most part, the fleshing out of my master's thesis before I received my master's. And Churchill played a big part in that. As a précis and an abstract, so that I don't do the rekindling and retelling of episode 3, Michael Collins' The Empire Blinks, what I talked about was the fact that we had this bundling of events between 1916 and 1922 that in 1922 led to the dismantling and abandonment of the 800-year-plus occupation of the southern island of Ireland by the United Kingdom as a result of a number of circumstances. Was Michael Collins solely responsible for it, or Churchill, or the Blacks and Tans, or anything like that? No, not at all, because that's not the way history works. The way history works is that you have this collision, whether coincident or cumulative or causative, in which a number of events clash into each other, and then all of a sudden, through the magic synergy of whatever events or complex of events, like in regional conflict complexes, takes place, something else comes out of the other end of that collision. And in this case, the claim that I made was that after the UK was suffering an existential period of fiscal and martial exhaustion from 1918 to 1920, what happened, and I will put this in the show notes. As a matter of fact, you can listen to episode 3 if you want to know, but I'll put it in the show notes. What was called the WWII massacre in India, and that's British India. That's the Raj, in which there was a General Dyer who was in charge of quite literally killing and injuring thousands of Indian unarmed civilians in the massacre. And as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, I love Churchillian speeches, even though I find Churchill, the man, to be rather suspect at times. In 1920, in the House of Commons or Parliament, he gives a speech called the Amritsar speech, which I think is the most brilliant and probably the most morally concussive speech of his entire career. I mean, here we have a man who is, he's 46 years old at the time he makes the speech. He has suffered some infamy and aspersions on his character as a result of his role in the disasters at Gallipoli and what he had done as an influential war minister in the cabinet that were suboptimal and ineffective at best and cost, well, in the case of Gallipoli, tens of thousands of lives. So here we find him giving this amazing speech, which is, by the way, in certain respects, un-Churchillian, because he seems to care for the Indian peoples, because he doesn't really, as we'll see later on when I talk about some of the highlights of why I disagree with putting Churchill on a pedestal. But nonetheless, what we find there is we find this young, vital Churchill with this brilliant speech. Michael Collins is nose to nose, eye to eye with the British Empire, and he's putting his finger in their chest and he's saying, after 800 years, it's time for you to leave and we will finalize a divorce. So as a result of the WWII massacre, as a result of the fiscal and military exhaustion for the UK after World War I, as a result of the troubles in Ireland from the 1916 rebellion, and as a result of the November 1920 Bloody Sunday massacre of intelligence assets that were placed by the British in Ireland proper. And then the Blacks and Tans, a unit that was Churchillian in its origin, go to the Croke massacre and start maiming and killing civilians in a very large way, which speaks, oddly, in a tangential fashion to the condemnation on the one hand of WWII by General Dyer, and then on the other hand, here we have the Blacks and Tans, a customized Churchillian unit that goes in to give people wood shampoos over their taking exception to being British subjects because they want out of the empire. So I'm telling you all of this to let you know that I am not casting nonsensical aspersions at Churchill as this great lion of the West, because I simply don't consider him that for very substantive reasons. Now, we could spend an entire episode 3, 4, 5. We could spend hours or dozens of hours on this, hat tip to Daryl Cooper. But I'm not going to do that because, I like to keep these a little more brief than that. But nonetheless, in the show notes, I will give you access to a very comprehensive article by the late Ralph Raico, where in, it's exhaustive fashion, he goes from birth to death, delineating all of the awful things Churchill did during his lifetime. Now, mind you, balanced, like we should be, in the consideration of all historical things. Am I condemning Churchill and saying he never did anything well? Well, certainly that wouldn't be the case, because I just said his Amritsar speech was not only the best speech of his career, but maybe one of the best speeches in the 20th century that specifically calls out the just immoral and blood-soaked excesses of the British Empire in this case. One could also say the excesses of the West in all of their colonial franchises. And mind you, it's the end of World War I, 1918, November 11th, 1918, the end of World War I. It is also the beginning of the end for all the colonial holdings planet-wide. And what we will find, of course, and I'm going to fill in some of the blanks here, but it's going to be a highlight more so than a comprehensive appraisal, that by the end of World War II and by the end of the year 1948, the British Empire, which for hundreds of years had been astride an empire on which the sun never set, found themselves with rocks for the most part, after India left the British fold. Mind you, they had commonwealths, but those commonwealths were a courtesy because the British had no political or military impact on those nation states like Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, and the others, in which we do have a Five Eyes relationship today. But nonetheless, the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, British Army, they can request in the most polite, gentlemanly fashion for Canada, Australia, et al. To do this or that, but it is simply a request. They can't order them about because that's the way a Commonwealth relationship works. They have rocks planet-wide, from the Falklands to Pitcairn Islands to places in the Indian Ocean, but for the most part, rocks is what the British Empire is comprised, outside of the United Kingdom proper. And I know that many folks say that Churchill is the great man of the West. Churchill is a great man of Great Britain. Churchill is Western man personified since 1066. He represents the best and brightest of us. He represents those things on which we would hold our moral standards. Well, I beg to disagree. That man for me is William Wilberforce from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but that's for a podcast episode in the future. So Raico's raking of Churchill, I will provide that in the show notes. I would urge all of you to take a look at that if you want a very comprehensive list and narrative framework for all the pratfalls, pitfalls, and foolish things that Churchill did to make the West so much worse off than it would have been without him on the world stage. One thing I'm never going to take away from Churchill is personal bravery, personal valor, moral courage, that kind of thing. Now, could he take the last, that moral courage, and direct it in a sensibility that would make one's hair stand on end and say, well, that's not quite what we were looking for? Absolutely. And also, look, with these criticisms I'm about to levy against him, he was a man of his time. He was a man, so I don't commit these presentism blunders that other historians, especially credential historians, do on a regular basis. He's a man of his time. Is he anti-black? Is he anti-Indian? Is he anti-Jewish? Does he have notions that most people would find repellent or maybe morally inappropriate today? It's possible. But remember, here we are today, not to pass judgment on how he felt about certain things, or he happened to fall under the moral auspices of a period of time that we don't happen to share, that we may look back and think, being morally superior, well, we are better than they are. I would caution all of you not to come to that conclusion too rashly, because I love to call my listeners' attention to Chesterton's fence, which is that if you're trying to fix something, if you're trying to recreate something, if you're trying to make something better, before you destroy something or before you diminish something, always look at it and ask yourself, well, why'd they put that fence there in the first place? And be honest about that assessment. Churchill wrote a lot, as I mentioned, over 100 books when you count them all out. Churchill had some very odd convictions. Churchill blamed Jews, for instance, quote, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence and impossible equality. He leveled that at the Jews. Visiting the Mussolini dictatorship in 1927, he said, quote, if I had been an Italian, I am sure I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism. End of quote. Of Mussolini, he said, quote, what a man, I have lost my heart. Fascism has rendered a service to the entire world. End of quote. And in 1935, Churchill expressed admiration for Hitler. He praised, quote, the courage, the perseverance, and the vital force which enabled him to overcome all the resistances which barred his path. End of quote. A mere 5 years later, he would bet his political career as a man who was rather out in the wilderness, in his own terms, to take on the prime ministership when the threat of Hitler's war on Western Europe would become manifest. As I mentioned earlier, I talked about his Royal Irish Constabulary Special Reserves, who were referred to as the Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries. Those were his signature achievement at the time when it came to dealing with Ireland, because he was knee-deep in the bloodshed that was occurring in Ireland. As a matter of fact, as Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921, and at his newly established Middle East Department, he finally got to deploy his aerial bombing strategy. Now, this had the benefit of being cheaper than ground subjugation of the many uprisings by Arab and Kurdish tribes in the area of the modern state of Iraq. And it also allowed Churchill to experiment with this idea of using chemical weapons on the, quote, uncivilized natives. As a matter of fact, he called for the use of some kind of asphyxiating bombs against Arabs. Mind you, this is 21 to 25, who he described as a lower manifestation, end of quote, of humanity, with his customary racist contempt. His interest in chemical weapons also extended to India, of which he said, quote, I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against the uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror. End of quote. What I find remarkable about this, too, is I told you about the Amritsar speech that he gave in Parliament in 1920, in which he's condemning the Jallianwala massacre, yet here we have him endorsing the massacre of, incredibly, civilians. But I would say that one of Churchill's signature crimes would take place in the Bengal famine of 1943, when 4 million people died needlessly as Britain exported the region's food produce to Great Britain and other Commonwealth countries in order to keep the war going. Churchill reviewed India as a mighty reserve to be dipped into liberally for the purpose of defending the empire during World War II. In effect, to be exploited for the purposes of extending its own oppression, if you looked at the writings of a lot of the resistance organizations in India proper at the time. This included massive loans of money to Britain from India. Imagine this, where you force your client state to give you loans. Most likely these are favorable loans, and that the shipping of its food and other resources around the empire, including that of Bengal, where that Bengal famine occurred in 1943, to the Middle East. Churchill disgusted fellow members of the Imperial administration with his sheer callousness during the resulting famine in 1943. Churchill, like many proponents of empire, was steeped in theories of the racial superiority of white people and was full of contempt for imperial subjects he considered racial inferiors. Mind you, I am not condemning Churchill for these notions because he was a creature of his time. He reserved a special hatred for the Indian people, who had been under the British gauntlet and reigns, as it were, since the 18th century. He said, I quote, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion," end of quote. He said the Bengalis themselves were to blame for their starvation, quote, "for breeding like rabbits," end of quote. Strategic bombing. What you find is that strategic bombing during World War II in Europe began on 1 September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland and the Luftwaffe began bombing Polish cities. As this war continued, bombing by both the Axis and the Allies increased significantly. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, in retaliation for Luftwaffe attacks on the UK, which started on 16 October 1939, began bombing military targets in Germany, commencing with the Luftwaffe seaplane air bases at Hormuz on the 19th and 20th of March 1940. One of Churchill's strategic calculuses in this was because of Operation Sea Lion, the potential invasion of the UK by Germany would need lots of what one would refer to in the naval forces as maritime connectors, in this case taking amphibious organizations and amphibious ships and running it across the channel to land troops in the United Kingdom proper. So I mentioned 16 October 1939, they began bombing military targets in Germany, and then they bombed German seaplane bases in March of 1940. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began targeting British civilians in the Blitz. And then after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Luftwaffe started attacking Soviet cities and infrastructures, and some of this started to turn around. But nonetheless, in the European theater of operations, it was the UK and the US, UK in this case being in the pilot's seat, started bombing civilian targets throughout the entirety of the war, resulting in Dresden, the firebombing thereof, and everything in between and not between all of those, where the strategic bombing took place in a way that didn't simply target belligerent military targets, but also civilian factories and civilian places where folks live. Dresden would be Exhibit A. These were all vociferously and endlessly championed by Winston Churchill. At the end of World War II, and again thinking of British geostrategic interests, he turned on whole swatches of the heroic resistance movements that had so undermined the Nazi occupation of Fortress Europe. This new turn against national resistance movements was exemplified by British forces massacring 28 peaceful protesters and injuring 128 in Athens in December 1944, immediately following the Greek people's ejection of Nazi forces. Now, mind you, there are mountains of literature delineating so many of these things that Churchill did during World War II. We haven't really touched on the details of some of his missteps and miscalculations in World War I. And then, of course, I've detailed in the most cursory fashion what happened in certain colonies before World War II and during World War II. And I think that this is part of a very large, comprehensive, and emblematic laundry list of immoral things that Churchill sponsored, authored, or favored. After World War II, we see a major undertaking by Winston Churchill to write his famous or infamous, however you view it, 6-volume history of that conflict. And he took a number of years to do so. And one thing that you find very interesting is that if we examine the dollars involved, for instance, in that particular literary undertaking, it's astounding. And a lot of it was ghost-written, and a lot of it bends history to give him a favorable position that belies what the historical facts were. In David Reynolds' book, he talks about a note on money. Quote, Churchill's original book deal in May 1947 for 5 volumes was worth £500,000 or just $2.23 million, but estimating what that money was worth in today's value is extremely hard. The exchange rate has fluctuated, but nonetheless, he made an extrapolation here, and it looks like, thus, the value of the book deal in today's money might be estimated at anything between $18 and $50 million for 6 volumes. And the $60,000 that Time Inc. and the New York Times paid for Churchill's working vacations translates into range from $420,000 to more than $1 million. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of money in a country that in 1954 stopped rationing food. And again, from David Reynolds. The Second World War was therefore a vast and intricate work, composed over a period of 7 years. Each volume was different, reflecting a distinct phase of the war and also a distinct phase of Churchill's post-war life, which is why I've written about each one in turn. But taken together, they offered unique personal impressions of the war and its leaders, voluminous documentary evidence that scholars could not then expect to see until the next century, and especially in the first 3 volumes, informed narratives of key battles and diplomacy. Their cumulative effect was to highlight Britain's contribution to victory at the time when a tide of American memoirs and movies gave the impression that Uncle Sam had won the war single-handedly. But Churchill's deepest objective in writing them, apart from making money, was a search for vindication. Like most political memoirists, he wanted to show that he was right, or at least as right as it seemed credible to claim. One appeasement, he succeeded spectacularly. The reputation of Baldwin and Chamberlain have still not recovered. Likewise, in 1940, his stark contrast between the feeble French and the defiant British has shaped English language history ever since. On the second front, and D-Day, he offered a plausible but not compelling defense. On the origins of the Cold War, as the contrasting reviews of Volume 6 indicate, he satisfied his own countrymen, but not Americans, as to the myopia of U.S. policy. End of quote. What we have here is we have a man who, yes, had exhaustive primary and secondary source documentation to include having to sidestep and dance around enigma, code breaking, and those kind of things, which wouldn't be revealed until the 21st century. But there was a lot of bending of the truth that went on in these 6 volumes. But let's revisit that other book that I recommended about the Bengal famine, Secret War of the British Empire and the ravaging of India during World War II. Mukherjee, please, I apologize if I've slaughtered your name. In 1947, quote, Winston Churchill hired a team of researchers and ghostwriters to formulate the definitive history of World War II. As historian David Reynolds has detailed, the treatise was in actuality a memoir of epic proportions, one in which fact often fell victim to selective memory. When Churchill read out loud parts of the history he was writing, Lord Moran, who remembered the events differently, would wonder, Could it be that he had come to believe what he wanted to believe? The Bengal famine received but fleeting mention in a document that happened to make it into the appendix. Despite their distortions, the 6 massive volumes became the primary references for a generation of historians, which may explain why the famine is almost totally absent from the tens of thousands of tomes since written about the war. Behind the scenes, Leopold Amory had done his best to ensure that all the blame for the calamity would fall within India. In 1943, Viceroy Wavell had faced a vociferous demand from Bengal's politicians for an inquiry into the famine. The Secretary of State for India had advised against any definite commitment to that end. When it became impossible to stave off the inquiry, he had helped the Viceroy select the members of the Famine Commission and to impose specific limitations of the kinds of topics which the inquiry is permitted to consider. There would include an avoidance of strategical and other circumstances as may have contributed to internal transportation difficulties or affected Her Majesty's government's decisions in regard to shipping of imports. Again quoting, hints of a cover-up abound. Amory's diaries do not contain any mention of scorched earth, and his papers are missing the pertinent correspondence with India. The testimonies submitted to the Famine Commission were reportedly to have been destroyed, except for one copy that survived as the Nanavari Papers. Civil servant Leonard G. Pennell stated in his unpublished memoir that he had retained his own set of testimonies, but its location is unknown. The unpublished memoir of civil servant Olaf Martin, written sometime after the war, is missing pages that appear to have dealt with his refusal to serve as Chief Secretary of Bengal. At that time, I had to be careful what I said, Martin recalled of 1943, just as, at present, I have to be careful of what I write. Again quoting, it also appears that the Famine Commission suppressed the results of a government-sponsored survey on famine mortality. Instead, it provided its own estimate of the death toll, a figure that remains controversial to this day. The Public Health Department has recorded 1,873,749 deaths during 1943. Subtracting from this total the average number of deaths per year, the Commission got 688,000 excess deaths during the famine year. And again, here we see Churchill behaving in a fashion that is most ungentlemanly. Quote, fiercely evident through almost every War Cabinet discussion on India in 1943 is Churchill's rage. Rage because the colony was slipping out of his grasp, and rage because in violation of the laws of nature and man, it had turned from being a debtor to a major British creditor. As late as 1947, Churchill would write in a draft of his war history that India was the greatest war profiteer. A similar charge would be made of His Majesty's government. It stockpiled food during famine, and by selling such liquid assets, must have made a comfortable profit on the rising market after the war, according to historian R.J. Hammond. Churchill and Cherwell were convinced that for the United Kingdom to owe money to India was a monstrous injustice, and that the colony should be forced to bear the entire burden of war expenses. All the evidence points to the Prime Minister and his closest advisor having believed that Indians were ordained to reside at the bottom of the social pyramid, such that their financial ascendancy as creditors during the war became a source of frustration and fury. Long after India had obtained independence, the Prof would describe the abdication of the white man as the worst calamity of the 20th century, more deplorable than 2 world wars and the Holocaust. End of quote. This is just appalling, but I'm not surprised by it. I can just imagine if they had tape recordings or we had access to secretarial minutes during a number of these meetings with Churchill throughout World War II that we would find similar outbursts and moral outrages. And here's something very interesting from the book. Quote, in June 1953, after witnessing the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, Churchill found himself standing next to Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, while they both waited for their cars to drive up. Quote, you must have hated the British for the treatment meted out to your father. Churchill said, it is remarkable how he and you have overcome the bitterness and hatred. She said, we never hated you. He replied, I did, but I don't now. Not long after, Churchill suffered a debilitating stroke. Believing that he was about to die, he told Moran, albeit with a great many reservations, that he had been wrong about India. What exactly he regretted, the doctor's account gives no clues. End of quote. That's interesting to find that he felt that way. Now, during the war, he did a number of absolutely horrific and immoral things. And again, I'll bet you can look at every great political actor during every war, not only World War II, where they would be doing despicable and immoral things. There's no doubt in my mind. But I call your attention to something that was just absolutely horrific, and that would be Operation Keelhaul. Stalin could make all the noises that he wanted about communism and the Soviets and all of that, but remember, for 6 years plus in this war, he and Stalin had basically been business partners, collaborators, political allies, quite literally political allies. So then we have, from 19 August 1946 to 9 May 1947, Operation Keelhaul. Operation Keelhaul was a forced repatriation of Soviet citizens and members of the Soviet Army in the West to the Soviet Union. While forced repatriation focused on Soviet Armed Forces POWs of Germany and Russian Liberation Army members, it included many other people under Allied control, to include women and children. Refoulement, the forced repatriation of people in danger of persecution, is a human rights violation and a breach of international law. The Operation Keelhaul would have been called a war crime, but we all know who won the war. So instead of going into the boring, legalistic details of this, I want to draw from a book. You will find this book in the show notes. This book is by Nikolai Tolstoy. To me, I consider it the go-to book on Operation Keelhaul. Victims of Yalta, The Secret Betrayal of the Allies, 1944 to 1947, and I read from page 355. Quote, conforming to agreements with the Soviets, an attempt was made to entrain 399 former Russian soldiers who had been captured in German uniform from the assembly center at Dachau on Saturday, January 19th, 1946. All of these men refused to entrain. They begged to be shot. They resisted entrainment by taking off their clothing and refusing to leave their quarters. It was necessary to use tear gas and some force to drive them out. Tear gas forced them out of the building into the snow, where those who had cut and stabbed themselves fell exhausted and bleeding in the snow. 9 men hanged themselves, and 1 had stabbed himself to death, and 1 other, who had stabbed himself, subsequently died, while 20 others are still in the hospital from self-inflicted wounds. The entrainment was finally effected of 368 men who were set off accompanied by a Russian liaison officer on a train carrying American guards. 6 men escaped en route. The report ended, quote, the incident was shocking. There is considerable dissatisfaction on the part of the American officers and men that they are being required by the American government to repatriate these Russians. Thus, for most Soviet POWs, being shot in a German concentration camp was far preferable to being tortured and executed on their return to the Soviet Union. End of quote. Mind you, this was a result of a consideration given by both FDR and Churchill and a concession granted to Stalin at the Yalta Conference. And mind you, one of the reasons why this remains obscure even today is because 3 volumes of records entitled, quote, Forcible Repatriations of Displaced Soviet Citizens, Operation Keelhaul, were classified top secret by the U.S. Army on 18 September 1948 and bear a secret file name. Have these been released? As far as I know, they haven't. If my listeners know of these documents being released, let me know. But they estimate 2 to 5 million former Soviet citizens and soldiers were repatriated to a fate, for the most part, unknown in the USSR. This has FDR's signature on it. This has Churchill's signature on it. So, in conclusion, I consider Churchill to be a fantastic rhetorician. I consider Churchill to be a monster politically. I consider him to be a warmonger. I consider him to be a war lover. I consider him to be tactically incompetent for the most part, and operationally and strategically paralyzed, if not incompetent, in a fair part of the missions and things that happened during the entirety of World War I and World War II, and his actions against colonial holdings between the wars. I'm not astonished that he did not remain prime minister after the war concluded in 1945. And I think that contemporaneous to the time, there were probably many rumblings where, with his flowery and wonderful language and speeches, nonetheless, there was a monster resident underneath. So thanks for listening. And please, if you get a chance, go to the show notes. If you get the opportunity, once again, Darryl Cooper, Martyr Made Podcast, an inspiration for my own podcast. If you get a chance to see his interview with Tucker Carlson, don't listen to what other people say about it. Listen to it yourself, and then come up with your own judgment, with your own knowledge, as a result of as dispassionate as one can be in the identification of all the biases of the writers and books that you may read, the interviews that you may hear. Come to your own conclusions. Don't be one of the herd mentality who just takes the advice or the meandering conversations of people you just so happen to agree with without examining it first. Because remember, sacred cows make the best burgers. I wanted to thank my readers for your solicitude. I wanted to thank you for listening to all the podcast episodes if you have taken the time to do so. I have a Substack. You'll find that address in the show notes. You can get in touch with me via email at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. And once again, thank you. This is Bill, out.